Boldwood presents Starting Over at Sunset Cottage, written by Lisa Hobman and read by Ailey Beaton. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1.
So that's it then, Flick?
Jim MacDuff raised his arms in exasperation.
You're leaving? You've completely given up on us after 6 years of marriage.
He was past trying to convince Flick that they could make a go of it, work things out, get through this and come out the other side stronger. The past few months had been one argument after another, and Flick had spent less and less time at home. The thought of being single again at 29 both pained and dismayed him. "It's for the best, James. And please don't call me Flick." She sighed. "It's not my name. Not anymore. I grew up." She snorted derisively. "It's good in the adult world. You should visit sometime. You might like it." Jim shook his head, sadness oozing from every pore.
Aye, well, you'll always be Flick to me, and I'll always be Jim. What's with all this Felicity and James rubbish anyway?
His accent always became stronger when he was angry. This was one of those occasions when the true Scotsman in him pushed through. The battle may have been lost, but he would go down fighting. His chest heaved as he tried to calm the storm raging beneath his skin. He almost didn't recognize the woman standing before him in their bedroom, her fitted designer clothes complete with neat gold chain and matching earrings and a shoulder-length, smooth, sleek hairstyle. Such a contrast to the girl he fell in love with at university. Back then she was all flowing blonde waves, strings of colourful beads and long floating skirts. She had stood out in her boho chic, and she was softer then in every way. Now, however, she could blend into any corporate stock photo. She rolled her eyes. "As I said, James, Felicity is my name." Flick was left behind at university. She was doe-eyed, foolish, and rash. "Look, there's no point going over old ground." She pulled the handle up on her wheeled suitcase. "I'll be staying with Polly and Matt for a while whilst I figure out my next move. I'll come for the rest of my things soon." Matt had once been Jim's closest friend. They had met at university and had immediately clicked, but that friendship had somehow fizzled out as Matt's relationship with his girlfriend Polly from their same university had blossomed. The lost friendship saddened Jim. Flick went on. "Nilsson Perkins have offered to help me find a new place to rent in Islington, so I can be closer to the main gallery." She wandered over to him and placed her hand condescendingly on his arm. "It's for the best, James. I think you know that deep down." He locked his gaze onto her cold eyes, his chest still rising and falling at a rapid rate.
For whom is it best, eh? For me? I don't think so.
His voice cracked as he shook his head. He stared intently, and for a brief moment she seemed caught in his gaze. He thought he saw her shield begin to melt, but she shook her head and looked away. Turning back to him, she shrugged her shoulders, a sad smile playing on her lips. "It was inevitable when you think about it. We're from two different worlds. We want completely different things, James." Her voice softened as she squeezed his arm. Her blue eyes that were once full of love were glacial. She wheeled her gaze towards the bedroom door and turned back to face him one last time. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears now, and Jim was relieved to see some, albeit small, expression of human emotion from the woman he had witnessed slowly becoming impassive, detached, and aloof. "For what it's worth, James, I do love you. You were my first love, and so I probably always will. I just feel like... She paused, clenching her eyes closed, as if to find the strength to carry on speaking, and several tears escaped. Like, maybe we're not good for each other. We've grown apart. I'm ambitious, and you want babies and the white picket fence thing. I'm just not ready. In fact, I'm not sure I ever will be. In a way, I'm doing you a favour. A sob escaped her throat as she spoke. This way, at least, you get to meet someone new and have children and do all the family things that I'm just not capable of. She sounded to Jim as though she was trying to convince herself. His lower lip began to tremble.
I don't want anyone else. Just you. For 10 years of my life, it's only been you.
He clenched his jaw.
What I don't get is that we were on the same page when we moved in together, and even more so when we got married. I don't understand how things changed.
Her nostrils flared and she angrily wiped at her eyes. Things didn't change. I did. Like I said, I grew up. She shook her head. You haven't changed, and therein lies the problem. She snorted. Sorry, Jim, but it's true. In all these years, you've kept the same hairstyle, the same clothing, and the same laid-back attitude. You always said you wanted to be a writer, but after a couple of published articles, you seem to have given up. You're working on a novel you'll never finish. You still work in the same second-hand bookshop. You still keep that ancient Land Rover, even though it's totally inappropriate for London, and you still take that bloody dog everywhere you go. He crumpled his brow. Even though the rest of her words had stung, he couldn't get past the part about the dog.
Jasper's your dog too.
It hurt him to hear the faithful canine being referred to in such an inanimate way. Ignoring his protestations, Flick added, Look at yourself. Seriously, you're not a student anymore, James. You're stuck in the bloody 90s, the decade you were born in, for goodness sake. It's ridiculous, and maybe I want more, huh? Like my mum says, I deserve someone who makes an effort. Her voice gained an octave as her emotions finally began to get the better of her. Jim widened his eyes in horror.
Whoa, now just hang on there, lassie.
He held up his hands and his stomach knotted at her stabbing words as they sliced his heart. He stepped towards her.
I don't care what Penelope's been saying. I do make an effort. Just because I'm in no way materialistic like your mother doesn't mean I don't care. She cares more about status symbols than she does about love. And I love you, Flick. I always have. You are my world. I don't need things, Felicity. I need you.
His heart ached as it bombarded the inside of his chest.
I've done everything in my power to make you happy. I don't know what else I could have done. And for the record, I'm not the one who's given up here.
He raised his voice too, finally giving in to the pent-up frustration he'd been harbouring. She gave a heavy sigh. We want different things. Accept it. Move on, please. She opened the door, and he made a grab for her. She swung around and crashed into his arms. Without thinking, he took her face in his hands and kissed her with all the passion he could muster. To his amazement, she didn't slap him, she kissed him back. Dropping her suitcase, she seemed overwhelmed by desire, anger, passion, lust, whatever the hell it was. She grabbed at his dark, shaggy hair as he ran his hands through hers, desperate to express his love for her, desperate to make her change her mind. He moved from her mouth to her neck, his kisses urgent. Her head rolled backwards and she moaned, grabbing at his t-shirt and pulling it over his head in one swift, aggressive movement. Before either could realise what they were doing or how they'd got there, they staggered backwards and tumbled, wrapped around each other onto the bed. Their lips locked as their tongues danced and probed each other's mouths. He rested his forehead on hers and looked deep into her eyes where tears had begun to escape and cascade relentlessly down her face, soaking through her hair.
I love you, Flick. I love you so, so much. Don't leave. Please, don't leave.
He breathed. His vision blurred as the tears in his eyes threatened to spill over. As his breathing calmed, Jim kissed her and smiled, stroking her face tenderly. He caught her tears with his thumb.
I knew you still loved me. I knew it couldn't be the end of us. I just knew it, Flick.
He smiled lovingly, his lip trembling again with overwhelming emotions fighting for release. He manoeuvred to lay by her side and held her close to him.
We'll work this out, you and me, Flick. We can get through anything. It's always been you and me.
He whispered as he stroked her cheek and kissed her again, deeply, passionately. She pushed him away, releasing herself from his arms and touching her swollen lips where his had just been. She grabbed her clothing from the floor and stood, dressing quickly, as she looked down where he still lay. I'm so sorry, Jim. Nothing's changed. I'm still leaving. Her wavering voice broke as she whispered the painful words he didn't want to hear. His heart plummeted and he sat upright.
What? I don't understand.
He quickly rose to his feet, yanking his jeans and t-shirt back onto his body. So many emotions battled and stirred inside of him, so many questions. He shook his head, his heart now pounding so hard he thought it would burst from his chest, and he asked again.
What do you mean, nothing's changed?
He pointed to the now crumpled bed.
We just made love, Flick. I don't understand. Why would you do that if nothing has changed? It has to mean something.
With a crease of regret visible between her brows and a look of deep, deep sadness in her eyes, Flick touched his face, tears leaving trails down her own cheeks. Oh, James, it was just such a beautiful way for us to end things. It was just goodbye, that's all. Gently, she stroked his cheek, picked up her case, and left. He stood for a moment, stunned, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. An uncomfortable silence fell over the house, and he was momentarily paralysed as if time was standing still. Hurt and angry, he wondered how the hell she could be so damn cruel, to ignite him with a spark of hope and then extinguish it so callously. Eventually, after what felt like an age, he recovered the use of his legs and walked over to the window. He looked down onto Bushbury Road below, with its row of Victorian terraces opposite that mirrored the one they rented, and observed Flick throwing her case into the back of the silly little convertible she was so very proud of. She was all designer suits, first-class flights, champagne dinner meetings, and sports cars. Now she was moving up in the world of art sales. Well, at least she fit in well with her new crowd, if not with him, he thought bitterly. She looked up to the bedroom window, and their eyes met. He saw her begin to raise her hand to wave, but she stopped, as if deciding the gesture was somewhat inappropriate given the circumstances. She gave a sad half-smile, climbed into the driver's seat, and drove away. Jasper, the black Labrador, padded into the room, walked over and nuzzled Jim's hand. It was as if he knew his master's heart was breaking. Jim scratched the Labrador's head and crouched down so that his face was level with the affectionate animal.
She's gone, lad. She's really gone. It's just you and me now.
His voice broke, and the dog pawed at him. He sunk his head into Jasper's fur, and it was then that he was overcome with emotion. It was then that he began to sob. Jim was grateful he had booked the weekend off work, but on Saturday and Sunday there were a few unwelcome comings and goings from the house. He made the effort to stay out of the way when Flick's new friends came to collect more and more of her personal belongings. They didn't speak much to Jim when he was there. They hardly made eye contact. He hid away at the kitchen table on his old laptop, typing notes up for the final chapters of his debut novel. Despite Flick's comments, he was determined to start submitting the historical fiction book to agents and publishers very soon. The actuality of Flick's possessions gradually dwindling saddened him. After all, the more items she removed, the less chance there was of reconciliation. He had gradually lost contact with his friends from university as they had gone off round the world to begin various careers. Jim and Flick had made new friends as a couple, art world friends. Except when it really came down to it, he discovered, they were his friends by proxy. These people didn't even have to choose sides. They were already on one. Flick's. If he was honest, however, the fact didn't concern him too much. He had always found her friends a little too arty-farty for his liking. He preferred straightforward and down-to-earth people. Flick and her friends were always discussing topics he couldn't really care less about. They'd sit for hours talking about the work of modern artists like Diamond Stingley and Lucia Iero, making comparisons with the more traditional artists like Claude Monet, Gustave Courbet and Salvador Dali. Jim had often sat staring into space and had mused that one day he would write a book about his random thoughts that formed as they all talked as a collective, while he sat on the sidelines, an audience of one to some pretentious chat show where every panellist thought their opinions mattered the most. In his humble layman's opinion, art was just an expression of the inner workings of someone's mind and was all subjective anyway, so what did it matter? If you liked it, you liked it, enough said. He was an intelligent man, but he never volunteered any content to the lengthy and rather tiresome debates. There would simply be no point. After what had turned into the worst weekend of his life, Monday morning hadn't come around soon enough. Jim loved his job. He had worked at the book depository on Lower Clapton Road, Hackney, for what felt like an eternity. And even before working there, it had been his favourite place to visit. He would sit in the tired old wing-back armchair with a dust-covered, tattered old book and a cup of coffee from the machine. He had spent hours in there and had come to know the owner Charles quite well. When he had discovered Charles's surname was Oswald, he had laughed out loud and complimented Charles on his choice of name for the shop. Charles had appreciated that Jim really got him. Eventually, he began to mind the shop on occasions when Charles had nipped for lunch or to the bank, and so one day, Charles simply decided to make it an official arrangement. The pay wasn't immense, but it wasn't minimum wage either. Charles was flexible about Jim nipping home to let Jasper out, and every so often the black lab would accompany him to work and fall asleep in the back, so Jim couldn't complain, and wouldn't have wanted to. Even for a Monday morning in February, the 25-minute walk to work was pleasant, and soon he was once again surrounded by two of his favourite things, the delightfully fusty smell of old books and coffee. On seeing Jim, Charles's face scrunched as if he'd encountered something rather unpleasant. "Bloody hell, Jim, are you all right? You look bloody terrible, old chap." Charles was a very well-spoken and dapper man in his early 50s. He always wore a colourful bow tie and a tweed jacket with elbow patches, much like an old English professor. He used the word bloody in almost every sentence. At first it amused Jim, then it irritated him, and now, years on, he was completely immune to it.
"Not great, if I'm honest, Charles, no. Flick left me on Friday.
His lip began to quiver again, as it had on so many occasions over the almost never-ending weekend, and he bit down on it, slumping into the wing-back chair and fighting for composure. Charles gasped, and his hands came up dramatically to cover his cheeks.
Oh, bloody hell, my dear chap. Are you sure you should be here? I can manage today if you'd rather be at home.
Jim held up his hand.
No, it's fine. I'm better off being busy, I think. No point wallowing in self-pity all alone, eh?
Jim tried to snap himself out of the drop in mood. Charles fidgeted as if wanting to make some kind of physical gesture, but struggling to know what to do.
No, quite. Well, if you need anything...
He paused as he seemed to be calculating his next words.
And in my opinion, old chap, it's her bloody loss.
Jim forced a smile.
Thanks, Charles. I appreciate it. Tell you what, I'd love a coffee if you're making one, eh? I'll go splash my face with some cold water and dump my bag in the back.
He stood and headed for the rear of the shop. His friend and boss nodded fervently.
Certainly. Bloody good idea. I'll get on to it.
The day passed without real incidents, and Jim was happy to be thumbing through the latest batch of antique finds that Charles had procured during his recent trip to a Parisian book fair. Amongst the finds had been a rare first edition of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Jim had inquired as to how much the book had cost, but Charles had answered by simply wincing and shaking his head.
Ouch,
Jim had thought. The book was one of a select few which were locked in a cabinet not to be touched by just anyone. One had to prove the funds were available to purchase such a rare and delicate piece prior to being granted permission to handle it, and even then, white cotton gloves were insisted upon. At the end of his shift, Jim said goodbye to Charles and made his way slowly back home. His legs and heart apparently unwilling to thrust him back into the home no longer occupied by his wife. The one saving grace was knowing there would be an excited welcome waiting from his canine best friend. When he had walked through the door, put down his bag, and finally calmed his overzealous ball of fur, Jim took out his mobile. He hadn't looked at it all day. There had been no point seeing as his only real friend was Charles, and he'd been with him all day. He noticed a missed call from a number he didn't recognise. Hesitantly, he retrieved the voicemail that had been left, and immediately regretted it when he heard Flick's voice.
James, it's Felicity. Listen, I've been talking to my friend Rory and, well, he's a lawyer, as you know. He says we can get a relatively smooth divorce. We can claim irreconcilable differences. That way we can both move on, you know, quickly and permanently. I know this is hard, James. It's hard for me too. She paused, and Jim thought he heard her crying. Anyway, I'll leave that thought with you. Take care, James. I hope you're okay.
Her voice broke, and the line went dead. It felt much too sudden, and was not the news he wanted. Her words cut him deep to his core, and the physical pain was almost overwhelming. He crumpled onto the couch as the word echoed around his mind. Divorce. That was that then. It really was over. He leaned forward and rested his head in his hands, his elbows on his knees. Divorce. Chapter 2. On the surface of it all, Flick was handling things remarkably well, but only on the surface. She still couldn't help wondering how much of this was her own doing and how much was the influence of her mother, Penelope. Her mother had never really liked James.
She didn't dislike him per se, she just didn't like him for her Felicity. Conversations had tended to take the same format whenever the topic of Jim came up at home. "Felicity, darling, you have such potential. You have goals and ambitions. Jim has... well, there's..." Her mother would wave her hand and feign being unable to think of a single thing her then-boyfriend had going for him. Flick was very much aware that Jim wasn't from the wealthy background she had been fortunate enough to be born into, yet it had never bothered her. Well, not at first. But clearly her mother had been fixated on the fact from day one, and her constant chipping away at the things Flick had once loved about him, his laid-back attitude, his lack of desire for the latest gadgets, his inherent lack of need to clamber his way to the top of a corporate ladder, had been bound to have an effect one way or another. She now realised that the last thing she wanted was to disappoint her mother. Since university, Flick had shone in her field of art procurement and history. She'd been headhunted by a prestigious gallery to work in sales, and everyone had said she would go far. She was painfully aware that her mother had hoped her silly fling with Jim would simply fizzle out after graduation, but much to her evident chagrin, it had grown and grown. Jim MacDuff was a very intelligent man, an erudite scholar in fact, just like Flick. But whereas he had been admitted to Oxford via a scholarship to study English literature, art history student Felicity Johnston-Hart came from a long line of Oxford fellows, her father included. It was the expectation that she would simply follow in their footsteps. On hearing the news of the breakup, her mother had insisted that Flick should come home to Cobham in Surrey to stay with her parents. She wouldn't hear of her newly single daughter staying with friends. She maintained that her precious girl needed to be around family at such a difficult time. Penelope was nothing, if not persistent. After the breakup on Friday and a fitful night of little sleep, Flick had driven to her parents' house on Saturday morning. She was exhausted, and as she walked through the door of her family home and into the arms of her doting father, she decided she would be calling in sick on Monday, perhaps Tuesday too. She needed time to recover. And perhaps to convince herself she hadn't just made the worst mistake of her 29 years. Sunday and Monday went by in a blur of tears and regret, and Tuesday was the first time she ventured downstairs before lunchtime. On her arrival in the pristine kitchen, she found her mother to be in rather high spirits. Flick, on the other hand, was not. Her mother's sing-song voice greeted her as she entered the room. "Good morning, darling. How lovely to see you so early." Flick glanced at the clock on the wall that told her it was 8:30. "Morning, Mum." She yawned and stretched. Her eyes felt sore and puffy, and she had recoiled on seeing her pale, drawn features in the mirror before she came downstairs. She slowly lowered herself onto one of the wooden chairs at the kitchen table and rested her chin on her hand. Her mother began to fuss over her as usual. "Are you feeling better, dear?" It was a stupid question, but Flick didn't bother to comment on the fact. Her mother filled the silence when Flick didn't answer immediately. "I heard you crying quite late into the night again, and you know how I worry. So, are you? Feeling better, I mean?" Of course she wasn't bloody feeling better. She was broken-hearted from the events of the previous few days, and no amount of tea and sympathy would remedy that. Since her arrival back at her family home, Flick's mother had assured her over and over that it was all for the best, that it was better to end the marriage now than wait until she was too old to move on. Maybe she was right. After all, James just didn't fit in with her lifestyle now. He hated her friends, knew nothing about art, apart from the knowledge she had imparted, and he had no ambition, none, not a jot. He was simply happy to write stories and read dusty old books. The stupid thing was, he'd graduated with a first from Oxford. The world had been his oyster at that point.
but it was almost as if he had done all that studying just to prove to himself that he could. After that, he was done trying, done achieving. Dragged from her thoughts, Flick remembered her mum had asked her a question. "I'm not great, Mum, to be honest. I feel drained, completely enervated." She sighed deeply as her mother poured tea into a china cup and put it on the table before her. "There's no wonder, darling. You should maybe call in sick for the rest of the week. Catch up on rest, perhaps," her mother suggested. "No, I can't. Daniel Perkins has emailed to say there's a meeting with a Tate this afternoon. It's a really big deal, Mum. He wants me to be there." She sipped the tea and winced when it was too hot. "They want me to go out to Chicago to see some potential pieces for the gallery. Daniel has recommended me as the best dealer for the job at Nilsson Perkins. If I call in sick again, I'll look like a flake." Her mother's face brightened. "Perhaps Rory will take you out tonight to cheer you up?" Her mother adored Flick's lawyer friend, deeming him a much more suitable match for her. Flick rolled her eyes and didn't answer. Her dad walked into the large kitchen where the two women were sitting, and Flick was grateful that the discussion was over before it started. "Good morning, Poppet." Her father, Edgar, kissed Flick's head affectionately. "How are you bearing up?" He gave her a knowing look, and she burst into tears. "Oh, Poppet, don't cry. You can always go back to him. You know he would take you back in a flash. Tell him you've made a terrible mistake." Her father took her hand and stroked her hair. "Oh, don't be so ridiculous, Edgar." Her mother chimed in. "What on earth would she do a silly thing like that for?" She stood to leave the room. The two were obviously still at loggerheads over the situation. "Because she clearly still loves him, Penny, that's why." His frustration with his wife's cold demeanour was evident. "Can't you see what you've done?" he continued. "You've put all these silly ideas in her head and she started to believe you. She adores Jim, she always has, but you couldn't let her be happy with him, could you?" He squeezed Flick's hand as she sobbed. Flick sat upright and pulled herself together. No, Dad, Mum's right. James is just not the right man for me anymore. I need to get over him. I need to focus on work. In fact, I was just telling Mum I'm going in today." Her father opened his mouth to protest, but she held her hand up to stop him. "It's almost an hour and a half to Islington from here, so I need to go get ready. They know why I've been off and have been great about it, but I don't want to take advantage." She paused, plucking up the courage to say her next words. "I think perhaps staying with Polly will be better for me too, if I'm honest." She smiled sadly. "Not that I don't appreciate you having me home. It's just not as far to travel to Islington from Camden Town, and I need to be in work. I need to keep myself occupied." She looked to her father and then to her mother. Neither spoke. Their conflicting opinions on the matter momentarily silenced. She rubbed her hands over her face to rid herself of the tears and donned a fake smile, stood, and left the room. As she walked down the hallway, she paused as she heard her father speaking. "I hope you're satisfied with the mess you've caused, Penny. You've meddled once too often in their relationship. I honestly don't understand why you couldn't just let her be happy and be in love. I can't support you in this. Frankly, I think it's unforgivable." She heard her mother gasp at her father's harsh words, and then the heavy, stomping footsteps that followed, and told Flick that her mother had seen fit to storm out of the kitchen. Flick's stomach knotted at the thought of her parents fighting over this, and she turned to walk back towards the kitchen, but stopped, deciding she'd had enough confrontation to last her a lifetime.
Chapter 3. Almost a year had gone by since he'd split with Flick, but Jim knew it was time to stop waiting. Time to start his life over. He could no longer hang around London waiting for Flick to realise she had made a mistake. The divorce had been finalised months ago, and he had moved out of the rented house they had shared as a married couple. He had been staying with Charles until his plans were completed. But today he would stop by to visit his old friend and ex-father-in-law one last time prior to making his journey to start his new life back home in Scotland. Even after all this time, Flick's father Edgar was still struggling with a breakup.
I just don't get it, Jim. It's breaking my heart to see this happening to the two of you.
He rubbed his temples and shook his head. Jim tried his best to smile, but struggled under the weight of emotion in the air.
I know, Ed, but I can't keep banging my head against a brick wall. There comes a point where you know you're being stupid. You just have to admit defeat. She's a silly, silly girl. She'll regret this. I know her, Jim, she will. One day, when you've moved on and met someone new, she'll realise what she had.
Edgar patted his arm affectionately. Jim looked down at his hands, unable to respond. How could he? What could he possibly say? After a long, thoughtful pause, he spoke.
I didn't want any of this, Ed. I honestly don't know what I did wrong. I supported her. I was there for her. We were saving to buy a house, you know. I reckon we could have afforded one. I was willing to put all my inheritance into bricks and mortar that were ours. She just wouldn't commit. I really thought we both wanted the same things.
He shrugged.
I think we did at first. I know, son. I remember how excited she was when you got engaged. She lit up when she looked at you. I wish she could think for herself and not listen to...
Edgar's words trailed off, as if he felt he had said too much.
Listen to whom, Ed? Oh, nothing. Don't take any notice of me.
Edgar's lip trembled.
I was looking forward to grandkiddies.
Jim squeezed his arm.
I know. We had a pregnancy scare once, a couple of years back. What do you mean?
Edgar sat upright at this news. Jim began to explain the events of that horrible July day.
So, what does it say?
Jim was almost boiling over with excitement. Flick remained taciturn as she stared at the little white stick, her hand shaking. After a while, she blinked as if coming out of a trance. It has a cross. I think that means it's positive. Her eyes welled up with what Jim presumed were happy tears. He grabbed her in a bear hug and showered her with kisses.
Oh, Flick, we're going to be Mummy and Daddy.
He spun her around. She yelled, "Put me down!" He immediately placed her back on her feet. He was a little surprised at her tone, but put it down to the shock of the news. She'd come round. But she just stared at the stick in her hand.
Flick, staring at it won't change it, sweetheart.
His voice wavered as sadness at her reaction washed over him. She shook her head as tears escaped and cascaded down her flushed cheeks. It can't be right. It can't be. I can't be pregnant, Jim. Not now. There's too much going on. We've not bought a house. My career is going well. You're still at the book depository, which pays next to nothing. We're not ready. She shakily sat on the side of the bath, her eyes staring into space once again. Jim gripped at his hair and for a moment tilted his head back and stared at the ceiling.
How can you not be happy, Flick? We're married. I adore you. This wee bairn will get spoiled by its grandparents. I'll be the best dad.
Stop it, Jim, please. I can't think straight. I can't do this. Not now. She stormed out of the bathroom, pushing past him, and slammed the door to their bedroom. After the bathroom incident, Jim didn't sleep well, and neither did Flick. She went downstairs very early, and after a while he heard her talking. He pulled on his shorts and walked down to the lounge where she sat, phone in hand. Yes, I have a urine sample ready from this morning. Yes. Okay. Okay. Okay, see you at 9. Thank you. Bye. She hung up. Jim sat beside her.
What was all that about?
He rubbed her back gently. I've made an appointment at the doctor's. I need to get this confirmed officially, Jim. Then I can decide what to do.
Then you can decide what to do? What do you mean, decide what to do? We'd prepare to have a baby, surely. There's no other decision involved.
She lifted her gaze to meet his. Jim, this is my body and my career. I have to make sure that I'm ready for this. She was calm as she spoke, her tone low and disconcertingly quiet. Jim tried to smile.
Hang on. There's a lot of I in there. What about me? Us? And what exactly are you saying? Are you saying that there's a chance you'll get rid of our baby?
He stood and paced the floor, a knot of anguish balled in his stomach. Flick lowered her head. I'm saying I'll have some decisions to make. She wrung her hands in her lap. Jim stopped in his tracks and turned to face her.
Oh, you'll have some decisions to make, eh? You, not us. All right, I get it. I get no say in this. My child, our child, and I get no say.
Don't raise your voice at me, Jim. This is hard enough as it is. He flung his arms in the air in exasperation.
What's hard? We wanted kids. This is a no-sodding-brainer.
What was she thinking? Flick stood. We wanted kids, eventually. This is too soon, and I will not speak to you whilst you're acting like this. I'm going to get ready for my appointment. She stormed back upstairs into the bathroom and locked the door. He followed her and shouted through the barrier she had put between them.
Well, I'm coming too. I need to be part of this, Flick. You can't shut me out.
Whatever, Jim, she mumbled. The doctor's surgery was overflowing with people coughing and sneezing. Flick sat silently, staring at her hands. Jim watched as myriad emotions made their mark upon her face.
She should be excited. I just don't get this.
He was about to take her hand in his when her name was called. They both stood, and, desperately needing the contact, he placed his hand at the small of her back as they walked through to see the doctor. Good morning, Felicity. What can I do for you today? The female doctor beamed at them, but didn't address Jim. I took a pregnancy test yesterday, which was positive. I thought I ought to get checked properly to make sure. The doctor's smile remained in situ. Oh, yes, wise to do so. Did you bring an early morning urine sample? Flick handed over a small bag with a little container in it. The doctor opened a long white plastic package about the size of a biro, then took it out and dipped the end of the implement into the sample. It doesn't take long. I'll give you a quick once-over whilst we wait. The doctor proceeded to check Flick's blood pressure and pulse. Well, you seem fit and well, which is good news.
After a few more minutes of Jim scrunching his hands anxiously, feeling somewhat invisible, the doctor checked the test. The doctor's smile faded.
I'm very sorry, but the test is actually negative.
Jim sat upright, confused. Flick let out a huge puff of air as if she'd been holding her lungs full. Right, well, that's that then. Her voice was back to its normal breezy self.
Hang on, that can't be right. The one yesterday was positive.
Jim barked.
I know, Mr. Johnston-Hart, and it is very rare to get a false positive. More likely to get a false negative, but in this instance, it is a false positive. Your wife is not pregnant.
He scowled.
It's MacDuff. Jim MacDuff. And you said yourself false negatives are more frequent, so what if yours is wrong?
He was clinging on to the last shred of hope, although he had no clue why, considering Flick's reaction. She smiled over her shoulder as she washed her hands.
I'm very sorry, Mr. MacDuff, but you can always try again.
Her tone was patronising and made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He stood and stormed out of the surgery, not stopping until he reached the Land Rover. Flick followed him, trotting along on her stilettos. She opened the car door and climbed in awkwardly, muttering under her breath how she hated the car.
Don't you think you're a bit harsh on Dr. Jacobson there?
She spat as he sat there, white-knuckled, holding onto the steering wheel and staring straight ahead.
No,
he growled back through gritted teeth.
Jim, it can't be helped. We have plenty of time, no need to get so stressed.
Now she was patronising him, making him bristle. After a long, silent interlude, Jim found the words he wanted to say, however hurtful.
The fact that it was negative after I got my hopes up was painful. But what's even more painful is that you thought the prospect of carrying my baby so abhorrent that you would have had decisions to make.
His eyes stung, and he bit the inside of his lip, determined not to let his sadness take over.
Jim, it just isn't the right time. My career is going so well.
Your bloody career? Is that what's more important to you than us creating a new life?
His stomach knotted with hurt and anger as he turned to face her.
Please don't be angry, Jim. Clearly you're more ready for this type of thing than I am.
She gave a half laugh, fueling Jim's pain.
More ready for this type of thing,
he repeated, his voice cracking as an angry tear escaped, much to his chagrin. Flick softened.
Oh, Jim, I don't know what to say. I love you so much, but I'm not ready to be a mother yet. And yes, I was relieved to find the test was negative. I'm so sorry. Please don't be upset with me.
She leaned over to him and kissed him, wiping away the errant tear with her thumb. He breathed in sharply.
Well, at least I know where we stand on the issue now.
He couldn't look her in the eyes. She squeezed his thigh.
We have plenty of time, sweetheart. You need to find a better job, and we need to save up for a house. It's just not the right time.
He swallowed hard.
Maybe not. But it scares me to think about what you would have done if the test had been positive, Flick.
She turned to face the front, making no attempts to answer, which in effect gave him the answer he was afraid of hearing. He started the car, and they drove home in silence. Edgar shook his head in frustration over what he had just heard. He was clearly as confused as Jim had been over Flick's reaction to a possible pregnancy.
I had no idea about any of that. She kept it very quiet.
He whispered croakily.
You'll make a wonderful father one day, Jim. I'm just so sad that it won't be my grandchildren you're fathering.
The emotional old man squeezed Jim's arm. Jim couldn't bear to see Edgar cry over this ridiculous situation.
I'd better be off anyway. I have a long drive and I really should get on the road.
He paused, then threw his arms around his ex-father-in-law. Edgar reciprocated the strong embrace and patted Jim's back.
Keep in touch, eh? Maybe not straight away, I know you'll be busy getting set up, but drop me a line every so often, even if it's that wretched electronic mail, although I do so prefer handwritten letters. But however you do it, let me know how you're getting on. You're still family, as far as I'm concerned.
Edgar's eyes sparkled with moisture as he placed a firm hand on Jim's shoulder. Jim headed for his Land Rover and opened the door. He called to his dog, who also seemed reluctant to tear himself away.
Come on, Jasper. Come on, boy.
The lab somewhat hesitantly jumped into the vehicle and Jim slammed the door. He looked back to Edgar, who was now wiping escaped tears from his haggard face with the back of his hand. Jim's heart squeezed as he watched the old man he had known and had been fond of for many years trying to deal with the fact that his daughter's marriage had collapsed and that he'd been helpless to stop it. Jim smiled.
You know, Ed, I just want her to be happy. I hoped I could be the one to make her so, but perhaps she deserves more than I can offer.
He said in the hope of making things easier for the old man. Edgar was having none of it.
Pish-tosh! She's so hell-bent on succeeding in that damned career of hers and listening to those who should know better that she's forgotten how to think for herself.
He was clearly angry about his daughter's life choices. Jim couldn't find the words to make an acceptable answer, so instead, he simply said,
You take care, Ed. I'll write when I get sorted. I'll send some photos too. Perhaps you could come and visit.
He knew there was little chance of Edgar making the journey hundreds of miles from his country pile in Cobham to the Scottish Highlands, but he at least wanted to make the gesture.
Yes, dear boy. That would be marvellous.
Edgar nodded, but Jim was unclear as to which part he was agreeing with and didn't want to ask.
Say goodbye to Penny for me. I'm sorry I missed her.
In all truth, he wasn't sorry in the slightest. His ex-mother-in-law was not his biggest fan, and he wasn't allowed to call her Penny. She preferred Penelope, and made a point of saying so whenever Jim tried to be a little more familiar. He had no doubt where Flick got it from.
I will, son, I will. You drive carefully. Make sure you have plenty of breaks, and don't drive if you feel tired.
Bless him. Such concern. A kindred spirit, unlike Penelope. Jim had simply never been good enough, rich enough, or posh enough for her liking.
And get writing, son. You've plenty of books in you just waiting to spring forth. Make this fresh start the new beginning of your new career as an author.
Jim had always loved that they had writing in common. Edgar had always told his son-in-law that he believed him to be a potentially best-selling author and that Jim just needed the right setting and the right encouragement. He now hoped that Scotland would give him that. He climbed into the driver's seat and gave a final wave before setting off down the long driveway. When he was nearing the gates, he saw a familiar little convertible coming towards him. He slowed when he realised it had pulled over. He did too, and then stopped. The driver of the car climbed out, long lean legs first, followed by slender body and pretty face, complete with stern, serious expression. Jasper wagged his tail as Flick made her way to the driver's side of Jim's car. She reached into the vehicle, petted the dog, who had now climbed into Jim's lap. Once she had finished greeting the black Labrador, she turned her attention to Jim. "I didn't expect to see you here. You're finally going, then?" Jim took the question as rhetorical. He mused at how, in that moment, she looked harder and more severe than he had ever imagined possible. Her blonde, blunt-cut hair resting at chin level, unlike when they had first met. Her designer sunglasses were perched atop her head, and she squinted in the sunlight of the cold winter morning. She had an air of superiority about her now that belied her true self.
"Aye, I'm all packed up and ready for the off."
He forced a smile, but didn't feel it inside. "You'll be relieved to get on with your new life now, I suppose. The decree absolute came through months ago. I'm surprised you waited this long," she stated matter-of-factly. Jim shook his head, the curve of his mouth taking a downturn.
"Aye, well, I had plenty of things to sort out, and I didn't want to leave Charles in the lurch, so I waited until he found a suitable replacement, and I found the right place to move to. I wasn't in a rush, like some people."
He felt sadly resigned now. "I'm sure Charles would have managed fine without you. He was fine before you came along. Moving on is the thing we both need." Why was she so determined for him to leave? After a pause, he looked back to her and said,
"Flick, we've been apart for ages now, and yet you still manage to make it sound like you're escaping some horrible, despicable fiend of a man."
She seemed to squirm under his gaze. "I don't think you're despicable at all." She shrugged. "You and I both know that we didn't work. It's over. We can continue to get on with our respective lives." She pulled invisible lint from the sleeves of her smart winter jacket, avoiding eye contact. Jim realised he was flogging the proverbial dead horse yet again.
"I'm sad you have such negative memories of our marriage. I, contrary to what you may think and feel, will remember our time together with fondness, and signed those divorce papers with a stab of regret and sadness in my heart."
He put the car into gear and drove away without giving her the opportunity to have the last word. He leaned over and scratched the top of Jasper's head.
"How did we end up here, eh, Jasper? I really wish I knew."
He began his journey northwards, the sound of Beautiful Day by Three Colours Red resonating around his beloved car. Chapter 4. Although he was raised in Scotland, Jim was by no means heading home. Dumbarton, place of his upbringing, held no pull for him now with his parents gone. Having been so devoted to each other, his mother had passed away only weeks after his father suffered one final stroke. They had put every penny they could aside for their sons. The brothers discovered after their parents' deaths that this was the reason for their frugal existence. The modest townhouse they inherited, on top of the savings, had meant that Jim could buy himself a place, albeit small and a little run down. Although the money had always been intended to set him up in a home with Flick, he'd saved it for years, not daring to dip into it lest it be swallowed up on minor frivolities. But that home, their home, clearly was never meant to be. The choice of his new location, Shieldaig, in the West Highlands, was more of an escape. He had visited as a child with his family when they were on holiday, but he didn't remember too much about it. His memories were all in the family photos he'd kept. He just knew that it was a peaceful, almost undiscovered place, certainly more his pace of life than London. And because he had no memories of Flick there, He knew he could start over. Wipe the slate clean. There would be nothing around each corner to remind him of what a mess he had made of things. He could reinvent himself if he so wished. Not that he would do that. He wasn't pretentious. That had been part of the problem, really. He couldn't pretend to be anyone but himself, and that hadn't been good enough. He'd come to realise in recent years that Flick was out of his league, but he also knew that he wasn't a bad person. Other than a failed marriage, he had nothing to be ashamed of. He had loved his wife more than life itself. He'd tried so damned hard to fit in with her life and all its glamour, but he simply wasn't that good an actor. His brother Ewan had escaped too. He had emigrated to Australia to be with the woman of his dreams, whom he had met 2 years ago whilst travelling through Europe. Jim was slightly envious of Ewan's relationship with Aisha. She was very easygoing and fun to be around. Every bit the beach babe. She had a petite frame, sun-bleached curly hair, and eyes as green as the brightest emeralds. Ewan had always been into sports and had excelled in football at school. He had been travelling around Europe with some of his football teammates when he was introduced to Aisha in a bar in Germany by one of his friends. Ewan was due a visit to the UK. He had promised Jim during their phone call a few days before that he would be back at some point this year and would be bringing Aisha back with him.
It'll be great to see you, bro. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to seeing where you end up living now that you're rid of Cruella de Vil.
Ewan chuckled. He had always seemed to like Flick, but in recent years that clearly had changed.
Ewan, please don't call her that,
Jim said flatly.
Hey, why the hell are you defending her? After what she did to you, I think you could be forgiven for calling her a lot bloody worse. Aye, well, it won't change anything, so what's the point?
Jim's voice was a low, resigned rumble.
Look, bro, I'm a fair distance away, I know that, but I'm only at the end of the phone, okay? You call me if you need to talk. Aye, I know. Thanks. Love you, bro. Aye, and I love you too, you ugly beggar.
Ewan chuckled and hung up. Jasper slept as Jim drove through the towns and cities of Middle England and on up through the industrial landscape in the north of the country. He breathed a sigh of relief when he finally drove across the border into Scotland. It was early evening and the borders were aglow with the low winter sun. The snow-capped Cheviot hills dazzled on the horizon as the sun glinted on the bright, glistening canvas spread over them like a crisp white blanket. It truly was a stunning sight. Thankfully, the weather had been rather kind, and the snow had not yet arrived in earnest. He was sure that this would most likely change once he had reached his new home. This was the worst time of year for getting snowed in, after all. As night fell, the journey was drawing to its conclusion. There had been several stops for Jim to stretch his legs and for Jasper to do his necessary doggy business. Service station coffee had most definitely improved, Jim mused, as he drank his third of the journey. The moonlit Highlands in winter, what a sight to behold. The rugged